Welcome to Wild Encounters at the BC Wildlife Park. My name is Alex, and today we're talking about western toads. I love talking about western toads. I think they're one of the coolest animals we have here at the park. They're one of my favorite animals to talk about just because they're this really interesting amphibian that has all these weird sort of quirks and little fun things, and even has a toxin that they can secrete. And we'll talk all about that in a little bit. But I just want to start by talking about the way we got these toads. So a lot of the animals we have here at the wildlife park come to us either injured or orphaned, or otherwise can't live a good life in the wild by themselves. And these toads are actually no different. They have a story as well. So a young girl sort of was playing in a pond and took some water home, and they realized long after they'd left that area that there was tadpoles in there. So what they did was they called the BC Wildlife Park and said, we have this bucket full of tadpoles, can we do anything? And that's when we sort of recognized we have this space and we can raise these toads to adulthood to become educational ambassadors and basically become species to show all of you and teach about these and really teach everyone else who comes to the park just how amazing these weird, cool amphibians are. So first thing I want to focus on was what these toads eat and actually what eats them. So when they're adults, like smalls here, they're mostly carnivorous. So it's a lot of small insects like those flying bugs we all think of, like flies and fruit flies, as well as a lot of actually crayfish and spiders and even beetles. What I thought was most interesting was actually when they're tadpoles, it's a much more herbivorous diet. So it's a lot of algae and plankton and actually detritus too, which is sort of the dead decaying plant matter on the bottom of those ponds or on the bottom of those rivers. One of the biggest things about what eats them is just the range of animals that want to eat these toads. So a lot of animals we sort of think of like foxes and badgers will eat these toads, but a really big one actually is birds of prey. So these toads are typically nocturnal, which means owls are one of the biggest predators for these toads. They're a very quick and easy meal, and because they're a little bit different from frogs, they can't get away quite as easily. So I want to do a little close-up here and show you how these toads look. They're very short and stocky and have these sort of very small, short limbs, and they're actually not very good at hopping. So compared to frogs with those really long back legs and really powerful muscles, they can't really maneuver or get away from predators in the same way. So these toads need a very different way to get away from those predators. So these western toads have what's called a parotoid gland. And you can see it on this picture right here, but it's a special gland that secretes this sort of sticky white substance that actually has a bufotoxin. So while these toads aren't inherently a toxic or poisonous animal, they do actually have bufotoxin and they can become a semi-poisonous amphibian. With that, what this bufotoxin actually does, what that substance actually does, is it makes the predator's mouth feel very numb and tingly and tastes incredibly bitter. So a good example I always use here is if you were biting into a hamburger and all of a sudden it was bitter and made your mouth really numb, you probably wouldn't eat that because you would think it would kill you. It's a very similar concept with these predators where they start to eat something and they feel their mouth going numb or they taste that really dark bitterness. They will believe that it will kill them and they'll probably spit that toad out. So because these toads can't run away in the same way frogs can, they can't run and hide in the water, they can't jump really far and jump away, they mostly just crawl along the forest floor. This bufotoxin is sort of their only way to escape being preyed upon by all that range of predators, all of those owls, hawks, eagles, falcons, foxes, badgers, a whole number of these different animals. So these western toads need 3 different habitats to survive their life in BC. So what they need is a breeding ground, which is typically a shallow body of water with really soft sandy sides and allows substrate to catch the eggs. They also actually need a hibernation habitat. So what that looks like is typically a burrow they've dug themselves or a burrow they're taking from another animal that's about 1 meter under the ground so they can avoid that frost line as much as they can. And the third one is actually a terrestrial habitat. So they can be found in marshlands, woodlands, mixed woods, and actually even grasslands. But the biggest thing is with those different habitats, they don't actually spend that much time in water beyond the breeding. So these toads can actually be found very far away from bodies of water, and they spend 90% of their life in those terrestrial habitats, on land, in the forest floor, in the grassland floor, and they don't actually spend much time at all except for the breeding period close to water. So we talked about how they can be found in those terrestrial habitats, those marshlands and woodlands and that sort of thing, but we haven't actually talked about where they can be found. So it's actually really interesting. They're found across most of the sort of Western North American continent, but they're mostly found sort of west of the Rocky Mountains, up into about Alaska, and across almost the entirety of BC, except for sort of a patch in the northeast you can see on this map right here. And they're actually found all the way down into northern Mexico as well. So they have this really large expanse of available habitat because they aren't as dedicated or don't need as much of that aquatic environment except for breeding. So they can spread quite a bit farther as well. So I've talked a little bit already about the difference between frogs and toads. And one again is that sort of shape of the body, the shape of those legs. But another really big one is the actual life cycle of these animals. So they have a very similar life cycle. They both start as eggs, they both become tadpoles, and then froglets or toadlets, and then full-grown toads or frogs. But the big difference is actually where they stay once being adults. So once those toads become adults, they typically will leave that water source to go into those terrestrial environments, to go into those marshlands or woodlands and get away from the water. Whereas those frogs will stay near that water their entire life. They'll never really leave that area unless they're in search of a different breeding grounds and different water area. But one of the coolest bits as well is just sort of the way this works, where we can find toads in places you would never really think to see toads. They do prefer damp woods, but they've been found up to 10 kilometers away from the nearest body of water in semi-dry environments like the grasslands. I just think it's really cool to talk about because it's really interesting to see how these two amphibians are so similar and still just so different at the same time. They have all these sort of quirks that make them better at jumping or worse at jumping and better at survival and better in the woods than in the water. And it's really interesting to see how that all sort of comes together. Another really big thing with the life cycle is around the amount of eggs they actually lay. So these toads will lay 12,000 to 16,000 eggs in one clutch. And that's a lot of babies, a lot of tadpoles. But again, they get preyed upon by a lot of different species. They get preyed upon by all kinds of fish, all kinds of birds of prey. So of those 16,000 babies, 99% will not make it to adulthood. What that means is that even though they laid this huge amount of future species, only about 1,000 of that might actually make, or 2,000 of that might actually make it to be fully grown toads. And I just think it's really cool because it's a really interesting way that they have ensured their survival is, okay, this animal is not surviving long, and they've evolved to now lay thousands and thousands and thousands of young to help that species continue to survive. When toads mate, they gather in large groups around those shallow bodies of water, and they actually have special sounds they use during this time. You might be thinking about that large ribbit or large croaking sound that we all kind of think of when it comes to toads and frogs, and you're totally right, that is one of them. And what's really cool with that sound is actually so loud that if they didn't have other ways to protect themselves, they could actually injure themselves and blow out their own eardrums. So what these toads or frogs do is when they make that really loud croak or really loud ribbit, they actually seal off their eardrums from their lungs, from the inside, so they don't end up hurting themselves trying to call for a mate, trying to find a female to mate with. Another sound they use is to distinguish males and females. So when they want to mate, the toad or frog hops on top of the female, and for the species to mate successfully, there needs to be a signal when a male jumps on top of another male. So they actually make a chirping sound that sounds just like this. What this sound really does is it lets a male know they're wasting their time trying to mate with another male. So it's a sound that only the males can make that really is a mechanism to help them all mate successfully and help them all contribute to the next generation of these frogs or toads. So these western toads can actually get sizable. So they're about 5.5 centimeters to about 14.5 centimeters. For size comparison, smalls here is probably about 8.5 centimeters, right around there, probably 9 centimeters. But they can get quite large, especially for these toads. They're also, I want to talk about real quick, is that toads can give you warts sort of myth. And it's actually not really true. Most toads and most animals can give you warts, but the really interesting part of that is that it actually can make them sick as well. So toads have this incredibly porous skin, and it's actually part of why they have all those warts in the first place, is they help them breathe by having more and more skin. And so what that does is your actual oils and the chemicals on your hands can then go into their skin and make them very sick. And if you touch yourself after having that bufotoxin or after they've secreted that bufotoxin, you can also make yourself sick. So while they can't give you warts, I still say you absolutely should not touch them unless you sort of know how to handle them or you need to get them out of a specific emergency situation. Other than that, when you do see a toad, just sort of look at it, let it be, let it chill there, because toads are just so, so cool and you should absolutely see them and appreciate them, but also let them be. Another big misconception people have about toads is that they make good pets. This comes from people recognizing that their natural habitat isn't that hard to recreate in human care, and that now that we know they aren't poisonous and they won't give you warts, they could be a fairly low maintenance pet. All this is true, but the biggest thing we like to say here at the wildlife park is that most reptiles do not make great pets because they can't understand that they're a pet in the same way your dog or your cat can. They also require very specific care, and they have very specific needs for water temperatures and heat lamps. So if you really want a toad or a reptile as a pet, make sure you do lots and lots of research on that animal, and make sure it's not an animal that was just taken out of the wild, because we want to make sure we don't disrupt their natural population and their natural habitats. So Western toads are actually listed as blue listed on the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And what that means, it's a lot of big words, is basically that these toads are listed as a species of concern. So it means they're not really on the endangered list yet, but if we don't sort of have some reach for them or we don't look out for this species, it absolutely could end up on that endangered list and it could decline in population. Some reasons for this are, again, they're really heavily preyed upon. So even though they lay that huge amount of eggs, a bunch of those, 99% of those eggs, will not make it to adulthood. Another big one is those different habitats they need. So if they need 3 different kinds of habitats, that's 3 different ways humans can really interrupt their process, interrupt their life, and make them either not able to breed because we took some water away, or not able to find a good winter spot because there's nowhere to dig down anywhere, or just operate in the grasslands. So Kamloops is in the grasslands, and there's a lot of grassland species we always talk about here at the park that humans have a huge impact on. The grasslands are already a pretty hard place for these animals to live, and us building roads and highways doesn't help them. So the biggest thing we need to try to do is just not hurt them more or make it worse for them or harder for them. With all that, I just want to end a little bit here and say toads are one of my absolute favorite animals to talk about. They're these sort of very odd amphibians that most people don't really think about that much or don't talk about all that much unless you're really into toads or frogs or that sort of thing. But once you start learning about toads and start learning about amphibians, they're just this insanely interesting group of animals that have all of these different kinds of abilities. You got the poison frogs and the giant frogs, and then the poisonous western toads like these guys who have that bufotoxin. It just gets in this huge category of just a million different kinds of these amphibians that are so interesting. So take some time, look through what animals you have around you, what animals we have here in BC, and try to go learn some really cool facts about whatever animal you find interesting right now. Because I guarantee you, whatever animal you kind of like, there's a bunch of information that you've never even heard before about that animal. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much. You can catch this on this network here, as well as on our YouTube channel, and there's always our Facebook page and our Instagram and our website at bcwildlife.org. Thank you so much. I hope you all got some really good things out of this.